Can Arc Raiders feasibly become Game of the Year? Greetings and, well, let's talk about this arguably pretty far out there concept and idea that Arc Raiders stands a chance at the Game Awards. This isn't a joke video or poking fun at Arc Raiders. Arc Raiders is a very good game, but I wanna do a little bit of a thought experiment and look at some of the details and the possible runner-ups that Arc Raiders has to compete against. So let's look at the game itself. Arc Raiders is a PvP multiplayer only game that is fulfilling a certain niche player base wish. And yes, games like Tarkov, other Battle Royale titles, and extraction shooters are a part of a PvP niche on the market. A lot of people do not play PvP games, a lot of people do not play extraction shooters. Even though the numbers are pretty high, player-wise and Steam chart-wise, it is still not a full-on mainstream genre, in my opinion. Case in point, there hasn't been a single game that is an extraction shooter that made it into the Games Awards Game of the Year consideration yet. So there is a very steep competition going on here. And why don't we look at it? First of all, the immediate competition. What does Arc Raiders have to compete against? First of all, the obvious contenders are games like Clair Obscur. Clair Obscur being a very interesting, almost surprise hit this year. And I think it is very likely considered probably one of the highest, if not the highest contender for Game of the Year. Now, player-wise and peak-wise, Expedition 33 has not reached the same audience appeal that Arc Raiders did. It had a much lower player peak on Steam. However, it's an entirely different genre, and I would argue what Expedition 33 is, that specific RPG genre that it is in, is a little bit more niche than generic PvP extraction shooters. But the overall audience and media appeal outside of its player base numbers make it a really, really strong competitor. In addition to that, we had Hollow Knight, and Hollow Knight already has higher player count numbers, higher overall peak player count numbers, all-time peaks, than Arc Raiders had. It's not much, but it's also a very small indie game, and keep in mind what Game of the Year winners were in the past few years and what games did win awards. We had, for example, Balatro and Astrobot, which actually got a Game of the Year win. So there is a chance, there is always the chance that certain niche games or small indie games are very, very strong competitions. And with how big Silksong was, it is already an insanely strong competitor to Arc Raiders. So this is just two examples of the immediate competition that Arc Raiders is going to run up against. In addition, let's also look at a few other fun examples, such as Escape from Tarkov, which I don't think that's going to have any kind of chance of winning anything at the Game Awards, but it has a very similar player count to Arc Raiders and is also a weird indie game. It also has extremely high ratings. I highly doubt that this game is going to be considered for anything. The same almost, I would argue, goes for Megabonk. Megabonk, I think, has a higher chance of getting some sort of reward. It being considered for the Game of the Year award, I don't know. But then again, Balatro was included in the Game Awards last year, so there could be genuine competition from small indie titles. Even though, Escape from Tarkov comes across like a joke game, it has a sizable player base. So don't underestimate the indie joke titles. So those are the absolutely immediate competition that this game has. Now, what about within its own genre? And when we're talking about genre, I want to talk specifically about multiplayer. If we're going by numbers alone, in theory, Battlefield 6 should also be very strong competition. When we're talking about it getting a reward of any kind, the immediate choice would be best multiplayer game. In this category, Battlefield 6 had a peak player count, an all-time peak player count of almost 700,000 players. Again, all on Steam alone. The current peak for Arc Raiders is around 350,000, 360,000. Now the game is much younger, or a little bit younger, than Battlefield 6, but still, when we're talking about the same genre, multiplayer PvP game, because again, Battlefield is mostly, primarily, multiplayer PvP. Even if we take into account some of the server browsers and the Portal, you know, the bot games, if we take that out of the equation, still the competition there would be similar. Battlefield had a much larger player number, but it is also an ongoing title. It is the 6th iteration of a series, while Arc Raiders is the first title ever to be released as a standalone title. Yes, it is within the extraction shooter genre, which is not necessarily a new phenomenon, but Arc Raiders is a unique new release. So I think the chances are much higher that Arc Raiders beats out Battlefield 6 for a multiplayer award of some sort, whatever that might be in the end. But now let's look at the biggest problem, and I don't want to make it too long here because, again, this is just a little thought experiment that I wanted to look at just for the fun of it. Arc Raiders is a PvP-only multiplayer game. Now I wanted to take a look at all of the Game of the Year winners, from the very first one to the very last one, and go through the list and take a look at, did a singular multiplayer game ever win Game of the Year? And I'm talking about primarily and only multiplayer game. No optional multiplayer, not an MMO or anything that has like a PvP component to it. I'm talking about primarily multiplayer. And if we go through the list, it's very obvious that it's looking very grim for Arc Raiders. The only game that won the Game of the Year awards was Overwatch, which is an multiplayer only game. It's probably the best example of just pure PvP game. It does have certain PvE aspects in the forms of the missions that were later introduced, but Overwatch in its entirety was a PvP shooter, a team-based, class-based shooter similar to Team Fortress. Now that was 2016. From the very first award that was handed out at 2003 up to the most recent award, which was last year, there only has been really a single PvP multiplayer game, a big PvP multiplayer game that actually won a Game of the Year award, which was Overwatch. Now, if you look at Overwatch's impact on the overall gaming sphere, I think it is fair to argue that historically speaking, and even in terms of recency, Overwatch probably has had one of the biggest impacts in the gaming industry. Whether you like the game or you don't like the game, whether you don't like what happened with Overwatch 2, that is irrelevant. The first Overwatch game had a massive impact on the space when it was released, to the point where I think the inclusion as a Game of the Year at that point was justified. Now we have to look at reality here. At the end, as we come to the end of this little thought experiment, we have to kind of look at this from a realistic perspective. Compare Overwatch to Arc Raiders. Compare both of their impacts, the specific genres that they fulfill, the specific niches that they appeal to, and you realize that for Arc Raiders to stand the slightest chance of becoming the Game of the Year, it would have to have an impact similar to Overwatch. Again, it is extremely rare that a multiplayer PvP title even gets the nomination for Game of the Year. It is then even more unlikely that it beats out all of the other games released in a year. Take into account Arc Raiders came onto the scene very late on, which doesn't necessarily disqualify it, but it goes up against more established titles this year, bigger releases this year. It is in a genre that has never had big success when it comes to getting Game of the Year awards. So how realistic is it that Arc Raiders will get Game of the Year? I would argue the chances are extremely slim. Now that doesn't mean that you can't vote for the game or you can't root for the game, but I don't know if it is even going to be included in the category of Game of the Year. Now if you want to vote for it for best multiplayer game or best PvP game, whichever category it is going to apply for, that is a different story. But I think we have to be a little bit more realistic with some of the goals that we're setting. I know that some of the streamers are very enthusiastic about the game, but it comes across as a little bit funny when we are creating hostility towards other games such as Expedition 33 and hope that people vote against it and vote for Arc Raiders, or somehow, Arc Raiders stands the slightest chance in this category. Either way, I think it comes across as just a little bit blind and just a little bit misinformed. Because if you look at the history, if you look at the current lineup, and if you look at the specific game genres that usually get up there for Game of the Year, Arc Raiders has some almost impossible competition, especially since we had some really surprising, positive, high-quality releases this year already. So how are the chances that Arc Raiders gets Game of the Year? I would argue probably none. But it's probably, maybe, possibly going to get Best PvP Game or Best Multiplayer Game. And I think that is also good. That is a more realistic and an equally as lofty goal, in my opinion. Getting any of the high-profile awards at the video game show, whatever you think about the video game awards, that is irrelevant here to the topic, but that's a prestige that you have gained. That shows that, hey, the market and the community and the overall gaming space has acknowledged you and your impact that you had this year. And I think this is where Arc Raiders has an actually realistic chance. That's just a really short look at the overall situation. I've seen discussions flare up about this, and I thought it would be kind of funny and interesting to look at the history and to see, and I was surprised as well to see almost no multiplayer games in the Game of the Year awards, which is honestly surprising, seeing that some of the multiplayer games out there were pretty big, None of the Battlefield titles, none of the Call of Duty titles has ever gained a Game of the Year award. No other big multiplayer titles have reached the height of being considered Game of the Year, besides Overwatch. Overwatch has managed to break through that ceiling, but reaching up to where Overwatch is sitting on its throne at the time, that is almost a little bit preposterous, in my opinion. So let's stay realistic, stay on solid ground here, and just hope that Arc Raiders gets the Best Multiplayer Award. That would be nice. And that's kind of all I wanted to lay out with the video. Kind of a bit of a realism check. I know it might upset a few people, but that's just how the video game awards seem to work. As a multiplayer game, your chances are very slim. And honestly, Arc Raiders is running against very, very steep competition. So set your expectations accordingly, please. Otherwise you will be disappointed. And let's see what happens at the Game Awards, right? And with that, I'm gonna see you next time.